Imagine unrolling a fragile scroll that hasn't been touched for over 2,000 years. The surface cracks slightly as it opens. Ink, faded but still visible, stretches across the parchment in careful lines. And then you begin to read. It speaks of a final battle, of light against darkness, of nations rising and collapsing, of an ending that feels less like a moment and more like an unstoppable process. Some readers have looked at these words and seen something unsettling, not just a reflection of the ancient world, but a prediction of everything that came after. So the question is hard to ignore. Was this scroll describing the future? Or are we seeing something else entirely? Because this isn't fiction. This is one of the most studied collections of ancient texts ever discovered. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd searching for a lost goat threw a stone into a cave near the Dead Sea. Instead of silence, he heard something shatter. Inside that cave and others nearby, researchers would uncover thousands of manuscript fragments. They became known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Among them was a text often called the War Scroll, written in ancient Hebrew, likely sometime between the 2nd century BCE and the 1st century CE. It describes a cosmic conflict between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. At first glance, it reads like a battle plan, but not for an ordinary war. This is a war that seems to involve the entire world. Armies gather. Nations fall into chaos. There are references to trumpets, formations, divine intervention, and then an ultimate victory, one side completely erased. But here's where it gets strange. Some of the imagery doesn't feel tied to a single moment in history. It feels bigger. A kingdom rises. Another collapses. Conflict spreads across regions. And somewhere in the middle of it all, the text describes a kind of final confrontation that sounds less like a single war and more like the end of an era. So people began to ask, was this predicting something that hadn't happened yet? Or was it describing something the writer was already living through? Because to understand the scroll, you have to understand the world it came from. This was a time of tension. Empires were expanding. The region was under the control of powerful forces. First the Greeks, then the Romans. Religious identity was under pressure. Violence wasn't theoretical. It was constant. And in that environment, many Jewish groups began writing what scholars call apocalyptic literature, texts that described the end, but not necessarily the end of the world. Instead, the end of the system, the end of oppression, the end of one order, and the beginning of another. The War Scroll fits into that tradition. Its final battle may not have been about some distant future. It may have been about hope. Hope that the current world, violent, unstable, uncertain, would eventually be replaced. But that explanation doesn't solve everything, because the timeline isn't perfectly clear. Dating ancient texts is complicated. Scholars examine handwriting styles, linguistic patterns, the material itself. Some fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls have even been carbon dated. Most evidence suggests the War Scroll was written before the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, which matters, because if the text describes events that happened after it was written, then the mystery deepens. But if it was written during a period of ongoing conflict, then it may simply reflect that reality. Still, interpretations vary. Some believe the scroll is a genuine prophecy, one that describes events still unfolding. Others argue it's rooted entirely in its own time, using symbolic language to describe real political struggles. And then there's another possibility, that parts of the text were edited or expanded over time, meaning what we read today may not be exactly what was originally written. And this is where things become complicated, because the idea of the end in ancient texts rarely means what modern audiences think it does. It's not always about the destruction of the planet. Sometimes it's about the fall of an empire, the collapse of a ruling power, the transformation of society. In other words, an ending that feels absolute to the people living through it, but isn't the end of everything. And yet, there are still details that feel difficult to ignore. Descriptions of prolonged conflict, a sense of inevitable escalation, the idea that the world moves toward a breaking point. Even if the scroll wasn't predicting our future, those patterns feel familiar, because history has repeated them again and again. Empires rise, systems strain, conflict expand, and people in every era start to wonder if they're living at the edge of something final, which may explain why texts like the War Scroll continue to resurface, not just in academic circles, but in modern conversations, online forums, documentaries, books that try to connect ancient prophecies to current events, wars, political tensions, global crises. But most of these interpretations go beyond the evidence. They take symbolic language and treat it as literal prediction. They connect dots that historians don't. And in doing so, they often miss the original context entirely, because the scroll wasn't written for us. It was written for a specific community, at a specific moment, facing very real fears. And yet, somehow, those fears don't feel distant, which raises a bigger question. Why do so many ancient cultures describe the end in similar ways? Why do they imagine conflict escalating to a final breaking point? Why do they frame history as moving toward some kind of conclusion? Maybe the scroll isn't remarkable because it predicts the future. Maybe it's remarkable because it reveals something about us. Because thousands of years ago, people were already asking the same question we still ask now. How does it all end? And what comes after? The War Scroll doesn't give a clear answer. It offers a vision, a symbolic ending, a final victory that may never have been meant to be literal. But there's something unsettling about reading those words today. Not because they prove anything, but because they don't feel unfamiliar. Maybe the scroll never predicted the end of the world. Maybe it was describing the end of a world, an empire, a system, a moment in time that felt like everything. But the question it leaves behind is harder to dismiss. Because if every generation has imagined itself on the edge of the end, then maybe the oldest prophecy isn't about when the world will end, but about how certain we always feel that it will.